Down here in the States, it is American Thanksgiving. On today's edition of Locked On Oilers, what Oiler fans should be thankful for from this past season and what we might be thankful for looking ahead.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this American Thanksgiving Thursday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. Want to thank everyone who's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's show is brought to you by FanDuel, where you can enjoy the NFL season with a big return. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So, in the tradition of American Thanksgiving, and to be fair, I am recording this episode on Wednesday because I am working on American Thanksgiving. I have to work some of the football games, the American NFL football games on Thursday. So I wanted to get ahead of things and have this episode out for you on what is a normal work day for you in Canada. But for the rest of us down here, most of us have off. I, unfortunately, am working. I wanted to do this exercise because I do think it's important. I am going to start here with a bit of a, I don't want to call it a monologue because the show is always effectively a monologue other than when we have guests, but so much of sports, especially now in 2024, soon to be 2025, we view it through the lens of how other people feel about things. You know, we're victims to social media narratives because media entities, whether we're talking legacy outlets, we're talking legacy media like Sportsnet or TSN, whether we're talking The Athletic or smaller, nicher, more boutique things like EP Ringside or a Patreon or a Substack for an individual hockey writer, so much of what's perceived to be important is driven by agenda setters. You know, there are people who, when they talk about things, that sets the agenda for the week, the month, the season. And for the Oilers, of course, coming off of last season, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the Stanley Cup final run because, frankly, that's one of those things that you will look back on for the rest of your life. As long as you have air in your lungs, there are going to be moments where you're going to think about games from that run. You're going to think about the Pickard win against the Canucks. You are going to think about that overtime loss to the Kings in the first round, the one game the Oilers lost in that series. You are going to think just how close that series against the Canucks was. You're going to think about how Stuart Skinner outplayed Jake Ottinger in the conference finals. And you're going to think for the rest of your life about Connor McDavid's playoffs, winning the Conn Smythe on the losing Cup final team. You are going to think about those clips from the Amazon Prime series that followed around the players of McDavid down 3-0 in the series, trying to will his team back in and ultimately coming as agonizingly close as you can. And so much of sports has been reduced to championship dialogue. It has become ring discourse because that is who and what the agenda setters at the top of the media food chain have dictated is the pertinent thread at this time. You know, we are dealing with the repercussions of Skip Bayless and Stephen A. Smith baiting LeBron forever about not having rings. And then LeBron won 3 rings between the ones in Miami. Oh, excuse me, 4 rings because he won the one with the Lakers too. I know that's relatively more recent than the others, the 2 in Miami, the 1 in Cleveland, but you get what I'm saying here. Those teams won. But we are still dealing with the repercussions of rings as the ultimate measure because we are captivated by success. And no matter what walk of life, if you're in business, we talk about how wealthy people are. If you're in sports, we talk about how many championships you have. The mythology of Tom Brady, of LeBron James, of Serena Williams, Michael Phelps, Usain Bolt, Katie Ledecky, Simone Biles, the uniformity and acceptance of this is what we want. We want unquestioned, unrivaled greatness. We don't want parity. And because of that, We view team sports through the lens of success. We view individual players in team sports through the lens of team success. And that's where it becomes challenging, because if you're sitting here right now in November of 2024, I don't think the Oilers season last year was a failure, even though they didn't win the Stanley Cup. You think about the journey that team went on. And I keep hammering home the idea of this season so far that the Oilers need to start building, start making incremental progress towards their big picture journey of hopefully avenging their Cup final loss and doing what Florida did, going to the Cup final, losing, coming back this following season and winning. But fundamentally, the Stanley Cup is the hardest trophy of the four North American sports to win. It's harder than the Larry O'B in the NBA. It's harder than the Lombardi, and it's harder than the Commissioner's Trophy in baseball. Hockey has the most upsets in the postseason of the four major North American sports. The game itself, hockey, lends itself to increased variability because of the nature of hockey. How many variables go in to every single sequence of every single play, of every single shift, of every single period, of every single game. There are so many factors that go into making things happen that you can't help but get caught up in the butterfly effect of, well, what if this happens or what if that happens? You know, I was talking with Hunter Hodes today on Locked On NHL, and I think about how game one of the Cup final against Florida, Zach Hyman has that scoring chance on Sergei Bobrovsky less than 15 seconds into the game. The Oilers ultimately lose that game 3-0. They have a lion's share. I want to say it was close to 60% of possession, 60% of the expected goals, and they just couldn't get one past Bob. You think about how different that series might have been if the Oilers are able to win game number one, or at least get on the sheet in game number one, where it doesn't feel so futile, so challenging, and how different that game could go, how different that entire series could go based on how that game goes. And you get caught up in the butterfly effect and you get caught up in the narratives. But you will remember the Oilers going to game 7 of the Stanley Cup final for the rest of your life. It has happened twice this century. They went to game 7 in 2005. They lost to Carolina. It happened this past NHL season. You lose to Florida. It is really difficult to make it to the Stanley Cup final. Think about it like this, and this will be the final thought for this opening segment where we talk about being thankful for the opportunity they had last season. There are 32 teams in the NHL now. We exist in a 32-team NHL. Sure, 10 to 15 of those teams have no real chance of being serious, even if one of them accidentally stumbles into the playoffs, like, for example, the Capitals last season. That team is not going to be able to make some noise in the playoffs. They are fundamentally flawed. You still have half the league that makes the playoffs. So let's just get to that. So 16. Of those 16 teams, probably 4 to 7 most years are serious Stanley Cup contenders. They have the capabilities, the facilities, the talent to be able to go the distance. And those teams are going to play each other at some point. There's going to be a meeting of the heads where quality is going to meet quality. And if you have a difficult path, a more difficult path, the Oilers got lucky in the first round last year. The Kings were a favorable matchup that they had dispatched 2 previous times. And I feel if they were to play again this season, would almost certainly do the same thing again. Vancouver, with a backup goalie, Brock Besser missed game 7 of that series. He had a blood clot in his leg. Elias Pettersson obviously was playing injured. The Oilers got relatively lucky in that series. I know they lost to Vander Kane at that point of the series. They inserted Philip Broberg, and it did help, but you got relatively lucky injuries-wise, and you played a backup goalie. And then you got to a conference final against a Dallas team that had played really difficult competition in Vegas and Colorado to get there. So we are going to take our first break of today's show. We're going to continue moving along this conversation as to what to be thankful for as an Edmonton Oilers fan. We just spent a good 9 minutes talking about being thankful for making the Cup final. A whole lot more to discuss on today's show, so be sure to stick around. Get ready to tackle NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL, all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join. Today, American Thanksgiving, triple header of football. Lions Bears kicking off the day. The Lions are 9.5-point home field favorites. Middle afternoon, of course, the Dallas Cowboys. They're hosting the New York Football Giants, who might be starting Drew Lock instead of Tommy DeVito, where the Cowboys are 3.5-point favorites. And then Thursday night, the Miami Dolphins heading up to Green Bay, where the wind chill is expected to be in the high teens or the low 20s. Packers are 3.5-point favorites. So head on over to FanDuel.com, where you can get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Today's show is also brought to you by our friends over at Gametime. You guys know me. It's the host of Locked On Oilers. I love going to concerts. I love going to games. Wednesday, I went to Devil's Blues with my friends. Friday night, I'm going to Creed with my friends. The only place I buy tickets to get to games is through the Gametime app. My personal favorite feature of the Gametime experience is the seat view, where you get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy, so you know what you're walking into. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Load Gametime today. What time is it? Gametime. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, where we are breaking down what to be thankful for. And this next one, this is a philosophy I have long had, both in about sports and in life. And I know great players generally say this, and it sounds very cliche, but be thankful people expect things from you. Be grateful that the Oilers have such high expectations. While expectations can also break teams, they can push players to a breaking point where they lose their confidence because they're feeling like they're failing to meet expectations. And that does create a snowball effect. But you have seen an incredible amount of resiliency from this team over the last 13, 14 months. You think about where they were in middle of November of last season with Jay Woodcroft as the head coach, what they ended up doing with Chris Knobloch, the 16-game winning streak, the 8-game winning streak, coming back from 3-2 down against Vancouver, coming back from 3-0 down against Florida to force a Game 7. That type of pressure, that responsibility, and this is something I genuinely admire about Connor McDavid, is he understands fundamentally that part of having as much talent as he is a responsibility to live up to it, to use it, to make it worthwhile for other people as well. You know, I always refer back to the anecdote where McDavid, as a 5-year-old, asked his parents if they could write a letter to Sidney Crosby, who was 15 years old at the time, who was playing for Rimouski in the QMJHL, was only 15 years old. And Connor wanted to ask Sid, how do you handle pressure? And you think about a 5-year-old thinking that, and how far along he was in his own journey already at 5 years old, and what a life of living with that pressure and holding yourself to that high of standard. You know, of course, Sid wasn't in the league yet at 15. He was still a kid himself. You think about the anecdotes you read about Connor McDavid's fanaticism for winning, for playing hockey, and you can't help but be thankful that guys like that exist, where all McDavid wants to do is win. All he cares about is winning. You know, I will think about the anecdotes coming out of that Game 7 where, yes, Gary Bettman announces he's won the Conn Smythe for the playoff MVP, and he didn't come back out of the locker room. And I know there are some people who said he's being a poor sport. You go out there, you accept the trophy, you show respect to Florida. He didn't care. For McDavid, it was about the guys in that room because they had just gone on the journey of their lives. You know, all the time on this show, I talk about how long an NHL season is, the journey, how grinding and grating and, frankly, fatiguing it is. You know, you show up the second or third week of September back in Edmonton for captain skates, for loose informal workouts, for preseason testing. You play a few preseason games. Then you get to the second week of October and the regular season starts. You have the entirety of October November, December, January, February, March, April. You have played 7 months of hockey, because you say half of September and half of April, just to get to the playoffs. And if you're a good team, and we've said all year, the Oilers' expectation is not just to make the playoffs, it is to go on a deep playoff run. And if the cards line up, if the stars align, you go to the Cup final and you win the Stanley Cup, because it does take some luck to win. That's the expectation, a deep, meaningful playoff run. But to do that, you're playing hockey for close to 10 months. And to play at a high enough level over the course of 10 months to win the most elusive trophy in North American sports is life-defining. You know, there's a reason that in all of these documentaries about teams from the 80s, the 90s, that these guys who are still in their 50s, still in their 60s, even older than that, guys 70s, 80s, that's not something a lot of people to live have ever done. You know, I always talk about how professional athletes, the uber wealthy, the richer than 99.9999999% of humans to ever exist in the history of the species, even fewer have won the Stanley Cup. If you were to do billionaires versus Stanley Cups, it's really close. I know there are very few billionaires. I believe it's about 800 billionaires in the whole world of about 8 billion people. I don't have the mental capacity to do the decimal places to figure out what exponent of that is, but we're talking about very refined. But there have been a lot of guys who have ever picked up a hockey stick, put on a pair of skates. I'm sure there are a lot of people listening to this right now that pulled on a pair of skates at some point in their childhood, their adolescence, their young adult life, and they closed their eyes and they envisioned being Sidney Crosby. That, for me, growing up, it was wanting to be Brian Leach. When you hear the mythology, you hear the reverence in which people talk about the great players in a sport, you fundamentally, you want to claim some of that as your own. And that's why we do things like pretend. That's why as kids, we attach ourselves to teams, to big ideas, because we understand that that's what legacy is. Even as young as some of these guys, you know, McDavid as a 5-year-old, even at 5 years old, Connor McDavid had an understanding that Sidney Crosby is going to be an incredibly gifted hockey player for a long time, and I want to be that. I will do whatever it takes to be there. And the burden of greatness is not for everybody. The burden of greatness can break guys. There are millions of people who at one point or another in their lives had pulled on a pair of skates in their middle teens and thought, if everything breaks right, I have a chance. If everything breaks right, I have a chance. And then eventually life happens. You have to focus on school. You have an injury. You're just not good enough. You're not physically talented enough. And that's why as I've gotten older, I have gained such an appreciation for how difficult it is to be successful in sports. There are so many people who at one point or another have wanted that. And only the very few actually get to go out there and do it. And every single time I turn on the TV, or even more grateful, the times I get to be in the building to watch Connor McDavid play hockey, it is truly a gift. And I know I just spent 9 minutes talking solely about McDavid and the burden of greatness, but we can, by extension, lop that onto Draisaitl, who is every bit as good. I don't want to do Leon dirty here by only giving him 30 seconds, but he's going to end up being one of the best, if not the best, European, non-North American players of all time. You know, we can get into arguments about Pavel Bure, Dominik Hasek, Nick Lidstrom, what have you. He's right there. When all is said and done, Draisaitl is going to be right there with those guys as best non-North American-born players of all time. It is a tremendous gift to have two of these guys on the same team, and it is why expectations are so high, and people expect the Oilers to win, because there are a whole lot of teams that have never had players this good at the same time, that have never had a best-in-the-world type player. We're going to take one more final break on today's show. We'll lighten the mood, be a little bit less existential, if you will, in our final segment, so be sure to stick around. If you're a renter, I'd start taking advantage of Built if I were you. Here's the thing. We earn points on groceries, travel, and practically everything else, but we should also be earning points on rent, one of our biggest monthly expenses. Built changed the game by letting renters earn high-value points on rent and in and around their neighborhood. With the seasons changing, there's no cost to join Built, and as a member, you'll earn valuable points on rent and your everyday spending. Built points can be transferred to your favorite hotels and airlines, even the ones you haven't heard of. There are over 500 airlines and 700,000 hotels and properties around the world you can redeem your Built points towards. Points can also be redeemed towards a future rent payment and unique experiences that only Built members can access. So if you're not earning points on rent, my question is, why not? Start earning points on rent you're already paying by going to joinbuilt.com/lockedonnhl. That's joinbilt.com/lockedonnhl. Make sure to use our URL so they know we sent you. One more time, that is joinbilt.com/lockedonnhl. Start earning payment points on your rent payments today. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out here on this Thursday, American Thanksgiving edition of Locked On Oilers, where we are recounting what to be thankful for in Edmonton Oilers fandom, culture, what have you. I do want to take a second here and say this because it's corny, but I do mean it. I really am appreciative and thankful for all of the people who have joined the journey since I started doing the show back in April. When I took over back in April, I was told it would be on an interim basis, and we would discuss, me and the Locked On folks would discuss what to do after the season ended. And the Oilers ended up going to Game 7 of a Stanley Cup final. We doubled the subscribers on YouTube. We added 20% new subscribers on audio. So to everyone who joined the journey at some point in the last few months as an endorsement, or even passively, of me, the content I do, I really want to thank you for joining this journey, because ultimately, as a content person, as a content producer, as a media person, I am only as valuable to the companies that have me as the audience I can bring. So from the bottom of my heart, if you're listening, if you're watching, thank you, appreciate you. You are part of this conversation. You are part of this journey. And I truly hope we do get to all bask in an Edmonton Oilers Stanley Cup together, because it would be one of the great privileges of my life. You know, I as a New York sports fan, have not had a lot of team success. I will probably pay for the Giants winning 2 Super Bowls for the rest of my life. They are amongst the biggest jokes in all of North American sports since winning that second Super Bowl. So I do not take the privilege of covering a really quality team, even if it's off to a slow start, even if I may be a little grouchy at times about the fact that they're messing around and not improving. But thank you. Last thing before we get out of here. As far as being thankful, the Oilers are still in position for something special. And I know I've wavered on that point at various times over the first 20 some odd games of this season. The underlying numbers aren't incredible. The power play and the penalty kill have a lot of work to do. The free agent additions of Victor Arvidsson and Jeff Skinner. We did an entire episode yesterday, which I highly encourage you to go check out, because it's a really good deep dive into why, even if Skinner's not playing great, I do think there is more meat on the bone there and something that the Oilers can do. There is definitely more for Jeff Skinner in Edmonton than what he's currently getting. You've got that as a possible positive regression. I know Stuart Skinner is often maligned and quite frequently mocked by people outside of the Oilers sphere, but he has shown the ability to get on a really nice run. And that's all you need. The recipe for success is the same as it ever was. Dominate your McDavid 5-on-5 minutes, win the Draisaitl 5-on-5 minutes, and then the rest of the team treads water. If that recipe works at 5-on-5, you win the game on special teams, and you pull away. You pull away with goaltending as your cherry on top. As I have said so many times since last year's postseason, if Stuart Skinner has to be the guy, the Oilers are probably going to lose most nights. If Stuart Skinner is just a guy on the team, someone who helps contribute, the Oilers are in really good shape, because he is a competent NHL goalie. If he does not need to be the difference between winning and losing, he can more than adequately tend to the sticks. The last thing I want to say as far as being thankful, be thankful, and I am thankful. As long as it took, the Oilers did not do a great job the first half, even 3/4 of McDavid and Draisaitl's overlapping tenures in Edmonton of surrounding them with quality players. And I have been very skeptical of some of the decisions of the players they've brought in. I've been very weary so far of the results of some of the players they've brought in. But they have tried, and when I say they, I mean the front office, to build out the quality supporting cast. On paper, the front office has done a reasonably adequate job of supplying the team with a nice supporting cast. Adam Henry, Connor Brown, and Matthias Janmark or Jeff Skinner, depending on who shakes out on that third line on the given day. It's not the best third line in the NHL. There are definitely some questions as far as long-term viability going into the season, holding up over the course of a playoff run because of the minimal offensive impact they've been able to have. But on paper, that's one of the better third lines in the NHL. It needs to play like it, though. And this will be the final thought of today's episode. The Oilers' offseason process, though I don't necessarily agree with all of it, I can understand what the Oilers were trying to do. They felt that they lost to Florida because they didn't score enough. So they spent a little more money on forwards. They took a little money out of their defense. They said, we can get by with a facsimile. We can recreate some of our defensive impact in the aggregate. We think we can develop a defenseman in Ty Emberson. And we think if we get a veteran in here who's going to play a safe, sound, responsible game, like a Travis Dermott or a Troy Stetcher, to complement what Darnell Nurse does, we think we're going to be okay. And there's a lot of hockey left to be played this year. And the last thing, be thankful the Oilers have all of this room in front of them. Soon, there's going to be fewer and fewer games. December and January are going to go by like that. And I know usually we say February is when the hockey season starts to feel like it's dragging. But once we get midway through February, that's when the hot stove starts to heat up. We all start looking towards the trade deadline. And then it's a mad scramble to the end. That'll do it for today's Thanksgiving edition of Locked On Oilers. I want to thank everyone who listened to today's show. If you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, throw the 5-star review. If you're watching over on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, hit the alarm bell. Thank you for joining the show today. I will be back tomorrow ahead of the Oilers showdown with the Utah Hockey Club. I will talk to you guys then. Until then, let's go Oilers.